At my son's wedding reception, my daughter-in-law Madison slapped me in front of 200 guests because I wouldn't give her the keys to my lake house. A man your age doesn't need waterfront property, she announced as I knelt searching for my broken glasses. My son Ethan stood silent. Every guest stared. Not one person defended me. I walked out humiliated but not helpless. I made one phone call to my financial advisor. 40 minutes later, she returned to the ballroom with documents that revealed the truth. The poor old janitor Madison was trying to steal from had been quietly accumulating assets worth $2.8 million. The room went dead silent when they realized their mistake. This is the story of how my family tried to rob me blind. And discovered I'd been 3 steps ahead of them all along. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, this story will remind you that appearances can be deceiving. Where are you listening from? Drop your location in the comments below. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's get started. Frank Delgado pressed his weathered thumb against the corner of his Social Security benefit statement. The paper crinkled softly in the humid Houston afternoon. His kitchen table held the familiar weight of routine, a plastic pill organizer with 7 compartments. A slightly bent Medicare card, and the day's mail spread like evidence of a life grown small. The ceiling fan ticked overhead. Each rotation stirred the stale air that smelled faintly of coffee grounds and the lemon cleaner he used on Sundays. Outside, sprinklers hissed across his neighbor's lawn while traffic hummed in the distance. Frank squinted at the fine print on his benefit notice. The numbers blurred despite his drugstore reading glasses. Maybe I really am getting too old for all this paperwork, he thought. His fingers traced the government seal on the envelope. 37 years of fixing broken pipes and burnt-out lights in Houston. Public schools had earned him this $1,200 a month and a pile of forms he barely understood. The Social Security office always felt too bright, too loud, full of people like him waiting in plastic chairs for someone younger to explain their own money. The front door opened with its usual squeak. Heels clicked across the linoleum toward the kitchen. Frank? Madison's voice carried that particular sweetness she used when she wanted something. Are you decent? She appeared in the doorway wearing a crisp white blouse and navy slacks that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Her perfume cut through the kitchen's stale air like a knife through butter. Behind her, Ethan fumbled with his phone, thumbs moving in quick taps. Just paying bills, Frank said, gesturing at the scattered papers. Madison's smile brightened. She moved to the table without asking and began gathering his mail into neat piles. Her manicured nails paused on an envelope from Sunset Grove Assisted Living. Frank watched her slide it toward the bottom of the stack. Frank, have you thought more about living somewhere safer? She asked. The word safer landed in his stomach like a small stone. I'm fine here. Frank reached for the Sunset Grove envelope, but Madison had already tucked it under a grocery store circular. Been in this house 23 years. But you're all alone out here, Madison continued. She picked up his pill organizer and shook it gently. The capsules rattled like dice. What if you fall again? What if you forget your medication? Ethan looked up from his phone. Dad, Mads is just trying to help. Those places have nurses on site 24/7. You'd like it. Frank forced a chuckle, rubbing the arthritis from his knuckles. The joints ached worse in Houston's humidity, especially before storms. I haven't fallen anywhere. Last winter, Madison said quickly. Remember? When you slipped on the ice? Frank searched his memory. Last winter had been unusually mild. No ice anywhere in Houston. But Madison spoke with such certainty that doubt crept in. Had he forgotten? Were there gaps in his memory he couldn't see? Maybe my mind really is slipping, he wondered. Madison continued sorting through his mail with practiced efficiency. She held up a notice from the county tax office, frowning. This looks important. Want me to handle the boring paperwork for you? I can manage my own bills. Frank's voice came out sharper than he intended. Of course you can. Madison patted his shoulder. Her touch felt more like ownership than comfort. I just hate seeing you stress over confusing government notices. After they left, Frank sat alone in the kitchen's fading light. The local news muttered from the living room television about Medicare scams targeting seniors. A reporter's voice described fake wellness visits, forged signatures, stolen homes. The segment showed a split screen an elderly woman crying in an empty house, official documents with her signature she claimed she never signed. Frank tightened his grip on his coffee mug until his knuckles went white. That stuff happens to people who don't pay attention, he murmured. But tonight, paying attention felt harder than usual. He shuffled the day's mail into a neat stack under the fluorescent light. The bulb buzzed harshly, making the white envelopes glow. Most were addressed correctly: Frank Delgado, 1247 Pine Ridge Drive. But the Sunset Grove brochure had a sticky note in Madison's handwriting, "For your consideration. Love, M&E." When had they toured assisted living facilities? When had anyone asked what he wanted? Frank stood and walked to his bedroom, each step creaking on the old hardwood floors. His reflection caught in the hallway mirror: gray hair thinning at the crown, shoulders a little more rounded than last year. Wearing the same flannel shirt he'd owned since Ellen's funeral. He looked exactly like what people expected from a retired janitor living on Social Security. In his bedroom closet, Frank pulled out a dusty metal cash box from the top shelf. His hands shook slightly as he opened the latches. Inside, beneath old photographs of Ellen and folded church bulletins, lay copies of property deeds and rental contracts that Denise had helped him file over the years. The papers bore his name in bold letters: Frank Delgado, owner. 4 rental duplexes in Northeast Houston. A small strip mall near the university. 40 acres of undeveloped land south of the city. And the lake house on 60 feet of Lake Houston waterfront where he and Ellen had planned to retire together. Frank traced one deed with his fingertip. The paper felt real, substantial. More real than the Medicare forms that confused him or the pill organizer that made him feel ancient. Invisible money lets you sleep, Ellen used to say. Visible money keeps you awake. They had lived modestly while building quietly. Every rental payment, every careful investment, every dollar saved from Frank's school district paychecks had gone toward this security that no one could see coming. But tonight, sleep felt impossible. Frank returned the cash box to its hiding place and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, his old Ford pickup sat in the driveway, a dark oil stain spreading slowly beneath the engine. The truck was 15 years old, rust showing around the wheel wells, but it ran reliably. Like everything else in his life, it served its purpose without drawing attention. Mrs. Chen from across the street waved from her mailbox. "Evening, Frank. You ever think about downsizing that old truck?" Frank waved back with a smile that felt forced. "She's got plenty of miles left." But Mrs. Chen's question echoed what he'd been hearing more often lately. Suggestions about what he should sell, where he should live, how he should spend his remaining years. Well-meaning advice from people who assumed they knew the shape of his finances. Nobody asked what he wanted. They just talked about what made sense for someone in his position. Someone in his position. The phrase stuck in his throat like a bone. Back inside, Frank poured himself a glass of water and swallowed his evening blood pressure medication. The kitchen felt smaller in the dark, walls pressing closer as night settled over the neighborhood. He could hear the hum of central air units, the distant bark of dogs, the occasional car passing on Pine Ridge Drive. This house had sheltered him and Ellen for more than 2 decades. Every room held memories: Ellen's morning coffee at this same kitchen table, holiday dinners with Ethan before Madison entered the picture, quiet evenings when they planned their future over spreadsheets and dreams. Now people spoke about this house like it was too much for him. As if the rooms themselves had grown too large for a man his age to fill. Frank locked the front door and turned off the porch light. Tomorrow, he decided, he would pay closer attention to the questions people asked and the assumptions they made. Something in Madison's voice, in the way she handled his mail, in her casual mention of assisted living, felt less like concern and more like calculation. As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, Frank's hand tightened on the wooden banister. If Ellen could see their son's wife sorting through papers like she already owned them, what would she say? She'd tell me to stop playing the harmless old man, Frank thought. She'd tell me to show them who they're dealing with. The bedroom was dark except for the red glow of his alarm clock. Frank set his glasses on the nightstand and pulled the covers up to his chin. Outside, the night sounds of Houston continued: air conditioners, distant traffic, the neighbor's pool filter humming to life. But sleep still wouldn't come. In the darkness, Frank admitted what he'd been avoiding all evening. Madison's visit hadn't felt like family checking on family. It had felt like someone taking inventory. A week later, Frank sat at his kitchen table staring at papers that didn't make sense. A Medicare explanation of benefits listed a cognitive health evaluation at a clinic he'd never heard of. The date showed 3 weeks ago. The provider was Dr. Sarah Harper, Geriatric Assessment Services. Frank turned the EOB over in his hands. The paper felt official, stamped with government seals and reference numbers. But the appointment time listed was 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday when he'd been at Roy's house helping fix a broken dock post. He remembered that afternoon clearly: the smell of lake water, the weight of the hammer in his hands, Roy cursing at a stubborn nail. Did I forget a doctor's visit? The thought made his chest tighten. Next to the EOB sat a pharmacy bag containing blood pressure pills he didn't remember picking up. The label showed his name, his address, but a prescription number that seemed unfamiliar. Frank opened the bottle and shook out 2 white tablets. They looked identical to his regular medication, but the bottle felt lighter than usual. A glossy brochure for Sunset Grove assisted living lay spread beneath the pill bottle. Someone had paper clipped a business card to the front cover: Madison Delgado, interested party. In the margin, handwritten notes listed room rates, care levels, and something called memory support services. Frank's doorbell rang twice, sharp and insistent. Madison entered without waiting for his answer, carrying a reusable grocery tote and wearing a bright smile that seemed practiced. Behind her, Ethan adjusted his smartwatch with quick, nervous movements. "Morning, Frank." Madison's heels clicked across the linoleum as she approached the table. "How are we feeling today?" The word rankled. Madison's eyes swept across the scattered papers before settling on the EOB in Frank's hands. She plucked it away with painted nails, barely glancing at the contents. "Oh, that," she said with a laugh that came too quickly. "Remember? The nurse practitioner who came by after your fall last year? Paperwork is just catching up." Frank searched his memory for any fall, any nurse visit, any appointment he might have forgotten. The harder he concentrated, the foggier everything became. Had there been a fall? Was his memory really failing? "I don't remember falling," he said slowly. Ethan looked up from his phone. "Dad, you ask about this stuff all the time. You're just stressed. Do I ask about it all the time?" Frank wondered. The doubt felt like ice water in his veins. Madison began organizing his papers with efficient movements. She folded the EOB and tucked it into her leather planner instead of leaving it on his counter. "I'll keep all the complicated stuff together for you, okay? You don't need to worry about medical billing." Her touch felt more like possession than care. Frank watched his Medicare card disappear into her planner alongside forms he hadn't finished reading. "I can handle my own paperwork," Frank said. "Of course you can." Madison's voice carried that same sweetness from the week before. "But why struggle with confusing government forms when I can make it easier?" She patted his shoulder, and Frank noticed how her hand lingered, as if measuring his physical response. As if testing whether he was still strong enough to resist. Later that afternoon, Frank walked to his mailbox at the end of the cracked sidewalk. The metal box sat empty except for a church newsletter and a pizza discount flyer. No bank statements, no property tax bills, no mortgage refinance offers that usually stuffed his box to overflowing. Roy called out from across the street, where he was washing his pickup truck. "Mail been light for you too, Frank?" Frank forced a grin. Guess they finally forgot about old people. But the joke felt hollow. In 30 years of homeownership, his mailbox had never been this empty. Bills arrived like clockwork: property taxes in November, insurance renewals in January, utility statements every month without fail. Frank returned to his kitchen and opened the junk drawer beside the sink. Beneath coupons for restaurants he'd never visited and rubber bands that had lost their stretch, he found a crumpled envelope from the county tax office. The postmark showed 3 weeks earlier. The flap was already torn open. "I never opened this," Frank realized with growing unease. The envelope contained his annual property tax assessment for the lake house. Someone had made handwritten notes in the margins: current market value, potential development, waterfront premium. The handwriting looked feminine, careful, deliberate. Madison had been the last person to organize this drawer. She'd insisted on helping him declutter last month, sorting through years of accumulated papers with the efficiency of someone conducting an audit. Frank smoothed the tax notice with shaking hands. The assessed value had jumped 28% from the previous year. Lake Houston property was becoming more valuable as Houston expanded eastward. Developers were buying up waterfront lots, building luxury communities for families fleeing the city's congestion. His house, modest as it appeared, sat on prime real estate. That evening, Frank dialed the number on the Medicare EOB. An automated voice guided him through an endless maze of menu options. Press 1 for claims. Press 2 for coverage. Press 3 for provider services. Hold music filled his kitchen, tinny and repetitive. 15 minutes later, a representative finally answered. "Thank you for holding, Mr. Delgado. How can I help you today?" "I have a question about a cognitive evaluation on my account," Frank said. "I don't remember scheduling this appointment." Computer keys clicked in the background. "Yes, sir. I see the claim here. Dr. Sarah Harper, billed for a comprehensive geriatric assessment. It shows as completed and paid. Who scheduled the appointment?" More clicking. "The referral came from your family physician, Dr. Martinez. The appointment was confirmed by phone with a Madison Delgado, listed as your emergency contact and healthcare proxy." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. Healthcare proxy. When had Madison become his healthcare proxy? When had anyone discussed giving her authority over his medical decisions? "Sir, is there anything else I can help you with?" Frank hung up without answering. The kitchen felt smaller, walls pressing closer as shadows lengthened outside the window. On the table, his pill organizer sat open like an accusation. 7 compartments, each filled with medications he was supposed to remember to take. But remembering felt harder when people kept telling him about things he'd forgotten. Frank walked to his bedroom and pulled out the metal cash box again. The property deeds inside represented more than money. They represented 30 years of careful planning, of living below his means while building something substantial. He and Ellen had sacrificed vacations, new cars, restaurant dinners, all so they could own something that would last. Now people talked about his property like it was too much for him to handle. As if ownership itself was beyond his capacity. Frank returned the cash box to its hiding place and sat on the edge of his bed. Through the window, he could see lights coming on in houses across the neighborhood. Families settling in for the evening, children doing homework, parents planning tomorrow's schedules. Normal life, proceeding as usual. But Frank's life no longer felt normal. It felt like something was being taken from him, piece by piece, with his own signature on the paperwork. His phone buzzed with a text message from Ethan. "Dad, Mads found a great memory care specialist. Dr. Harper can see you next week for a follow-up. Don't worry about the cost." Frank stared at the message until the screen went dark. Dr. Harper. The same name on the EOB for the appointment he'd never scheduled. They were planning his next visit to a doctor he'd never met, for problems they insisted he had, with money they assumed he couldn't afford. Frank set the phone on his nightstand and lay back on the pillow that still smelled faintly of Ellen's shampoo. Outside, Houston's night sounds continued: air conditioners, distant traffic, the neighbor's television playing too loud through thin walls. But for the first time in 5 years, Frank didn't feel like he was living alone. He felt like he was living under surveillance. Cypress Ridge Country Club glittered under Houston's evening sky like something from a magazine. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors while a jazz quartet played softly near the terrace doors. Frank stood at the edge of the ballroom in his best gray suit, the same one he'd worn to Ellen's funeral 5 years earlier. The fabric smelled faintly of mothballs despite his efforts to air it out. His tie, purchased at a discount store, felt tight against his neck. Around him, wedding guests moved in expensive clothes that whispered quality with every movement. Frank adjusted his drugstore reading glasses and tried to look comfortable in a room designed for people who never worried about money. Madison floated through the crowd in her wedding dress, a cascade of lace and crystals that probably cost more than Frank's annual property taxes. She stopped conversations with her presence, accepting congratulations and air kisses from women whose jewelry sparkled under the chandeliers. Ethan followed a half-step behind, handsome in his rented tuxedo, grinning with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who couldn't quite believe his luck. Frank nursed a glass of champagne he hadn't wanted and watched his son navigate this world of country club ease. When did Ethan start wanting all this? Frank wondered. The boy he'd raised had been content with fishing trips and backyard barbecues. But tonight, surrounded by marble and crystal, Ethan looked like he belonged in ways Frank never would. The evening progressed with speeches and toasts that referenced shared experiences Frank had no part of. Ski trips to Aspen, wine tastings in Napa, summer houses in the Hamptons. Madison's friends spoke a language of privilege that made Frank feel like a tourist in his own son's life. During dinner, Frank found himself seated at a table near the kitchen doors with other relatives who didn't quite fit Ethan's elderly great-aunt. A cousin who worked construction, Madison's twice-divorced uncle who drank too much. The conversation table, Frank realized. The place where they put people who might embarrass the important guests. As dessert was served, Madison approached his table with purpose. Her smile looked brittle under the harsh ballroom lights, and Frank noticed how her eyes kept darting toward the head table, where her parents sat with Houston's social elite. "Frank," she said, voice bright enough for nearby tables to hear. "We need to talk about the lake house." Frank's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Tonight? It's your wedding day. That's exactly why we need to discuss this." Madison's voice carried across the nearby tables. "Ethan and I are starting our lives together. We need privacy. We need our own space." Frank set down his fork carefully. Around them, conversations quieted as heads turned toward the drama. "The lake house has been in our family for 15 years. Your family," Madison corrected. "But families change, Frank. Families grow. And honestly, a man your age doesn't need a whole lake house to himself." The words hit like a slap before the actual slap came. Madison's open palm connected with Frank's cheek with a sound like a gunshot. His reading glasses flew from his face, skittering across the polished marble floor. The jazz quartet stumbled to a halt mid-song. 100 conversations died instantly. Frank dropped to his knees, fingers scrambling for his glasses among the chair legs and dropped napkins. His vision blurred without them, turning the ballroom into a watercolor painting of colors and shapes. Someone moved their chair back to avoid the broken glass of his champagne flute, but no one bent to help him. "Stop clinging to property you can't maintain," Madison announced, her voice ringing like a toast. "Give Ethan the keys. We need somewhere to build our life together. You're not welcome there anymore." Frank's fingers found his glasses by touch. One lens had spider-webbed completely, the frame twisted beyond repair. He slid them on anyway and looked up to find a circle of faces staring down at him, curious, embarrassed, entertained by the spectacle. "So this is what they really think I deserve," Frank realized as heat bloomed across his cheek. Ethan stood frozen behind his wife, hand hovering in the air as if he'd considered helping his father and thought better of it. His face showed confusion, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like relief that someone else was handling the confrontation he'd avoided for months. "Dad, Mads is just trying to help," Ethan said finally. "That place is too big for you. It's not safe for someone your age to live alone on the water." The statement cut deeper than the slap. Safety. As if Frank was a child who might wander into traffic without supervision. Frank struggled to his feet, knees protesting against the marble. His reflection caught in the mirrored wall behind the head table, gray hair disheveled, cheap suit wrinkled, broken glasses hanging crooked on his nose. He looked exactly like what everyone assumed he was, a harmless old man who'd outlived his usefulness. "The property taxes alone must be killing you," Madison continued, riding the attention of the watching crowd. "Let us carry that burden. Let us take care of the big financial decisions." Her words sounded generous to the wedding guests, but Frank heard the calculation underneath. Madison had done her homework. She knew about property taxes, waterfront assessments, the rising value of Lake Houston real estate. She also assumed Frank couldn't afford to keep what he owned. The assumption was her first mistake. Frank straightened his twisted tie and looked directly at his daughter-in-law for the first time since the slap. Madison, I appreciate your concern for my finances. His voice, though quiet, cut across the ballroom with unexpected authority. Conversations that had resumed now stopped again. Something in Frank's tone suggested the old man might have more to say than anyone expected. But I think you've made some assumptions about my situation that aren't quite accurate. Madison's confidence wavered for just a moment. Frank, we know you're struggling. We're not judging you. We just want to help. Help. Frank repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. The kind of help that involves medical appointments I never scheduled? Mail that disappears from my mailbox? Healthcare proxy forms I never signed? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Madison's face flushed pink beneath her makeup. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Frank retrieved his napkin from the floor and wiped his hands carefully. Just like you didn't know about the property assessor you brought to look at my house last month. Just like you didn't know about the guardianship consultation you had with that lawyer downtown. The color drained from Madison's face. Behind her, Ethan looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable. Guardianship? He asked. Mads, what is he talking about? Frank removed his broken glasses and tucked them into his jacket pocket. Without them, the ballroom softened into impressionist brushstrokes of light and shadow, but he could see clearly enough for what came next. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank said, addressing the watching crowd, with the calm authority of a man who'd spent 30 years managing crisis situations in public schools. I apologize for disrupting your evening. But sometimes family business requires a public setting to ensure everyone hears the same version of the truth. He turned back to Madison, whose wedding dress suddenly looked less like celebration and more like costume. You want the lake house? You think I can't afford it? You believe I'm too confused to manage my own affairs? Frank reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a folded paper Denise had given him before the wedding just in case. He unfolded it carefully, the legal letterhead visible to nearby guests. This is a property assessment from Harris County, Frank said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent ballroom. The lake house you want so badly? It's worth $1.2 million. And it's owned free and clear by a man who's been paying cash for real estate longer than you've been out of college. The ballroom erupted in whispers. Madison stood frozen, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. Ethan stared at his father as if seeing a stranger. Frank folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some phone calls to make. Starting with my attorney. As Frank walked toward the ballroom doors, his reflection in the mirrored wall showed a different man than the one who'd entered. Same gray suit, same old shoes, same arthritic hands. But his shoulders were straighter now, and his eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be less than he was. Behind him, Madison's wedding reception continued, but the music sounded hollow and the conversation felt forced. The old janitor everyone underestimated had just reminded them why appearances could be deceiving. And the evening was far from over. The ballroom doors closed behind Frank with a soft thud that seemed to echo in his chest. Outside, Houston's night air pressed humid and thick against his burning cheek. The parking lot stretched before him under flickering streetlights, a sea of expensive cars glinting like jewelry in the artificial twilight. Frank walked slowly toward his old Ford pickup, each step echoing on the asphalt. Around him, luxury sedans and SUVs sat in neat rows: BMWs, Mercedes, Lexuses that cost more than most people earned in a year. His truck looked ancient by comparison, rust showing around the wheel wells, a crack in the windshield that had been spreading for months. He fumbled with his keys in the dark, hands shaking from adrenaline and something deeper, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with the hour. The door handle felt familiar under his fingers, worn smooth by decades of use. Inside the cab, the worn steering wheel and cracked dashboard welcomed him like old friends. Frank sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Through the windshield, he could see the country club's glowing windows, silhouettes of wedding guests moving like shadow puppets behind the glass. The jazz band had resumed playing, their music floating across the parking lot in fragments carried by the humid breeze. If Ellen could see this, would she tell me to give up or stand up? He wondered. Frank pulled out his phone and stared at the screen's blue glow. The wallpaper showed a photo from their last anniversary, Ellen laughing at something he'd said, her gray hair catching sunlight on the lake house porch. She'd been gone 5 years, but her voice still echoed in quiet moments like this. Invisible money lets you sleep, Frank. But invisible strength just makes you disappear. Had Ellen ever said those exact words? Frank couldn't remember, but they felt true in a way that made his chest ache. He scrolled through his contacts and found Denise Park's number. His financial advisor had warned him this might happen, that Madison's interest in his assets would eventually move from subtle to aggressive. Denise had prepared contingency plans, legal documents, strategies for protecting what he'd built. But Frank had hoped family loyalty would make such measures unnecessary. Family loyalty. The phrase tasted bitter now. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from Ethan. "Dad, where did you go? Mads is really upset. Can we talk about this like adults?" Like adults. Frank almost laughed. He'd been treated like a confused child for months while Madison systematically positioned herself to control his life. Now that he'd shown he wasn't powerless, suddenly they wanted adult conversation. Another text arrived. "I didn't know about any guardianship stuff. Mads says she was just looking into options in case you needed help later. Please come back inside." Frank stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Ethan's ignorance might be genuine, but ignorance could be willful. How many conversations had Frank tried to start about Madison's increasing involvement in his affairs? How many times had Ethan dismissed his concerns as paranoia or age-related confusion? A third text appeared. "We can work this out. You don't have to embarrass Mads in front of her friends." Embarrass Mads. Not, "I'm sorry she hit you." Not, "I should have defended you." The priority was protecting Madison's reputation at her own wedding. Frank turned off the phone and laid it on the passenger seat. Through the truck's rear window, he could see other vehicles leaving the reception valets. Bringing cars around, couples walking carefully across the parking lot in formal shoes, the normal progression of a wedding night winding down. But nothing about tonight felt normal. Frank opened the glove compartment and pulled out a thin folder Denise had given him months ago, labeled "Emergency Documents," in her precise handwriting. Inside were photocopies of his property deeds, account summaries, and a letter from his Medicare insurance company questioning duplicate cognitive evaluations requested in his name. He'd dismissed that letter as a clerical error when it arrived. Now every mistake and misunderstanding of the past few months looked like pieces of a deliberate pattern. The property assessment he'd shown Madison was real, but it was only part of the story. The lake house was worth $1.2 million, yes, but it was just the largest asset in a portfolio that included rental properties throughout Houston, undeveloped land south of the city, and investment accounts that had grown steadily for 30 years. Frank and Ellen had lived modestly while building quietly. Every rental check, every dividend payment, every dollar saved from his school district salary had gone toward security that no one could see coming. They'd worn discount store clothes and driven used cars while accumulating enough wealth to last several lifetimes. Why did we hide it so well? Frank wondered. Were we protecting our money or protecting ourselves? The answer felt obvious now. They'd been protecting themselves from exactly what was happening tonight. From family members who saw assets instead of relationships, from people who measured love in potential inheritance. From the kind of manipulation that turned elderly parents into walking ATMs. But hiding had its own costs. Frank's invisibility had made him vulnerable to Madison's assumptions and schemes. She'd seen a poor old man who could be bullied into compliance because she'd never imagined anything else. A memory surfaced 3 months earlier. Madison had arrived at his house with a woman in a gray blazer who introduced herself as Dr. Harper. They'd stood in his living room while drive. Harper opened a clipboard filled with forms. "I just need to ask a few questions about your daily functioning, drive," Harper had said. Madison's voice had carried that rehearsed concern Frank now recognized. "Frank, if you refuse the wellness evaluation, the court might assume you're hiding cognitive decline." At the time, Frank had deflected with jokes and changed the subject. He'd thought they were overreacting to normal aging, being overly cautious about his independence. Now he understood it had never been about his health. It had been about establishing a paper trail of incompetence that could justify guardianship proceedings. Guardianship. The word made Frank's skin crawl. He'd heard horror stories from other seniors. Adult children who gained legal control over elderly parents, then systematically drained their assets while keeping them isolated and dependent. It was a perfectly legal form of elder abuse, sanctioned by courts that assumed families always acted in their loved ones' best interests. Madison had been building a case for months. The mysterious medical appointments, the healthcare proxy forms he'd never signed, the documentation of his supposed confusion and memory. Problems, all of it designed to paint him as a man who could no longer manage his own affairs. Frank's phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed Roy Mitchell's number. "Frank? Roy here. I saw the news footage from the wedding. You okay, buddy?" "News footage?" Frank's stomach dropped. "What news footage?" Channel 13. Some society reporter was covering the reception when things got exciting. "They blurred out most faces, but I recognized your truck in the parking lot. You making headlines now, you sly dog." Frank closed his eyes. Madison's public assault had been recorded and broadcast, probably already spreading across social media. By tomorrow, the story of the old man getting slapped at the country club would be Houston entertainment news. "Frank? You there?" "I'm here, Roy. Just thinking. Want to talk about it? I've got coffee on and nowhere to be." Frank almost said yes. Roy's kitchen table and steady presence sounded like sanctuary compared to the isolation of his truck. But talking required explaining, and explaining meant revealing secrets he'd kept for decades. "Thanks, Roy. Maybe tomorrow." "All right, buddy. But remember what Ellen used to say, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now." Frank smiled despite everything. Ellen had never said that, but it sounded like something she would have believed. "I'll remember." After Roy hung up, Frank sat in the growing silence of the parking lot. Most of the wedding guests had left now, leaving behind empty spaces and scattered cigarette butts that the valets would clean in the morning. The country club's lights dimmed window by window as staff prepared for closing. Frank's reflection stared back at him from the dark windshield. An old man in a cheap suit, sitting alone in a parking lot at midnight, wondering how his family had become his enemies. But beneath the reflection, another face looked back. The face of a man who'd spent 30 years building something substantial while letting everyone believe he had nothing. A man who'd survived Houston's public school system, raised a son, cared for a dying wife, and managed to accumulate real wealth without anyone noticing. Maybe it's time they noticed, Frank thought. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Denise Park's contact information. Her emergency number was for true crises only, but tonight qualified. Frank had spent months trying to preserve family relationships that apparently only existed in his imagination. Now self-preservation demanded a different approach. The phone rang twice before Denise answered. "Frank? Are you all right?" "Denise, it's time to use the file we built." "All of it? Are you sure? Once we start this process, there's no going back to pretending." Frank looked through the windshield at the country club where his son's wedding reception continued without him. Inside, Madison was probably explaining to guests how her father-in-law suffered from confusion and paranoia. How the family was doing their best to manage his declining mental state, how difficult it was to care for elderly relatives who wouldn't accept help. "I'm done pretending," Frank said. "They want to know who they're dealing with? Let's show them." "I'll make the calls tonight," Denise said. "How do you want to handle this?" Frank started his truck's engine, feeling the familiar rumble of the old Ford's V8. "Carefully, legally, and completely. If they want a fight about my capacity, let's give them one they'll never forget." As Frank pulled out of the parking lot, he glanced once more at the country club in his rearview mirror. The building looked smaller now, less impressive, like a stage set losing its magic when viewed from behind. Tomorrow, Madison and Ethan would discover that the harmless old janitor they'd tried to manipulate had resources they'd never imagined. They would learn that decades of careful planning couldn't be undone by a single slap in a ballroom. But tonight, Frank drove home through Houston's empty streets, finally ready to stop hiding who he really was. Denise's voice carried clearly through Frank's truck speakers as he drove through Houston's quiet suburban streets. "Frank, are you certain about this? Once we implement the protections we've discussed, there's no returning to the way things were." Frank pulled into his driveway and sat with the engine running. The house looked smaller than usual, its yellow porch light casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. I'm certain, Denise. They've already changed the way things were. I'll begin making calls tonight. Leonard is expecting to hear from me anyway. He's been monitoring the situation since Ellen passed. Leonard. Frank had almost forgotten about Ellen's cousin, the retired federal investigator who'd quietly kept tabs on Frank's welfare from a distance. Leonard Hayes specialized in financial fraud cases targeting seniors. His involvement suggested tonight's confrontation was part of a larger pattern he'd been tracking. After ending the call, Frank sat in the dark cab of his truck and let memories surface like photographs in a developer's tray. He'd been too focused on day-to-day survival to see the complete picture Madison had been painting. Now, in the quiet aftermath of the wedding disaster, patterns became visible. The lake house visit 2 summers earlier came back in sharp detail. Madison had stepped inside wearing white capri pants and a coral blouse that probably cost more than Frank's monthly grocery budget. Sunlight scattered diamonds across Lake Houston while burgers sizzled on his rusted outdoor grill. She'd moved through his modest rooms like an appraiser, eyes measuring windows, noting furniture, calculating square footage. "Wow," she'd said, standing in his living room. "It's really rustic." But her eyes hadn't shown appreciation for simple living. They'd shown disappointment in the lack of obvious luxury. Madison had expected waterfront property to mean marble countertops and crystal chandeliers. Instead, she'd found mismatched furniture, faded photographs, and appliances that worked perfectly despite their age. At dinner that night, she'd sat across from him at the same pine table where he and Ellen had planned their retirement. Madison had picked at her burger while asking questions that seemed casual at the time. "So Frank, is this property fully paid off? Any mortgages or liens? Do you have someone helping manage your bills and taxes?" Ethan had been grilling corn on the porch, half listening to their conversation. Frank had answered honestly because family deserved honesty, paid off years ago. "I handle my own finances." Madison's follow-up questions had felt like natural conversation. "What about property taxes? Those must be expensive on waterfront. Do you have good insurance coverage? Have you thought about estate planning?" Frank remembered thinking she was genuinely concerned about his financial security. Now he recognized an interrogation disguised as care. 6 months later, another memory surfaced with painful clarity. Frank had been standing on his back porch, enjoying the evening breeze off the lake, when Madison's voice drifted through the open sliding door. She'd been on her phone, pacing his living room while Ethan showered. "He's completely alone out here," she'd said to whoever was listening. "The house is huge, probably worth over $1 million, and honestly, I think he's starting to slip. If we can document cognitive decline, Ethan and I could argue that staying here while he transitions to care would be the responsible thing to do." Her tone had been matter-of-fact, businesslike. Not the voice of a concerned daughter-in-law, but of someone discussing a real estate transaction. Frank had told himself he'd misunderstood. Madison spoke quickly, used financial terminology he didn't always follow, probably talked to her friends about investments and market values. He'd dismissed what he'd heard as innocent speculation. "I heard exactly what she meant," Frank admitted now. "I just didn't want to believe it." The family meeting with Dr. Harper gained new significance in hindsight. The living room had smelled of lemon cleaner and old books as the supposed geriatric specialist flipped through her assessment forms. Madison had orchestrated the entire encounter, scheduling the appointment, briefing drive. Harper on Frank's concerning behaviors, positioning herself as the responsible family member seeking professional guidance. "We just want to make sure you're safe, Frank," Madison had said, reaching for Ethan's hand in a gesture that looked rehearsed. "These cognitive tests are standard for people your age." When Frank had declined to answer questions about his daily routines, Madison had leaned close and lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "If you refuse evaluation, the court will assume you have something to hide. That's how competency proceedings work." Competency proceedings. Frank hadn't known what those words meant at the time. Now he understood they were the legal mechanism for stripping elderly people of their autonomy under the guise of protection. Smaller incidents gained new meaning as Frank reconstructed the timeline. His Social Security cost of living adjustment letter had gone missing last winter, only to turn up stuffed in a grocery bag under his kitchen sink. Madison had found it and laughed off the incident. You must have dropped it while carrying groceries, Frank. Good thing I spotted it before it got thrown away. But Frank never carried mail with groceries. He opened mail at his kitchen table immediately upon collection, had done so for 30 years without deviation. The letter had been intercepted, examined, and planted where Madison could discover it while demonstrating Frank's supposed carelessness. Roy's evidence became crucial to the emerging picture. His neighbor had been documenting Madison's activities without Frank's knowledge, photographs of her meeting with property assessors, timestamps of her visits. When Frank wasn't home, records of mail delivery discrepancies. I didn't want to worry you, Roy had explained later. But something about that woman never sat right with me. Ellen always said to trust my gut about people. Ellen. Frank closed his eyes and tried to summon her voice, her perspective on the situation unfolding around him. She'd been the practical one, the planner, the person who insisted they build wealth quietly while living modestly. Money changes people, Frank, she'd said during one of their late-night conversations about inheritance planning. Not just the people who have it, but the people who want it. Promise me you'll be careful who you trust with our secrets. Frank had promised, but he'd broken that promise by underestimating Madison's ambitions and Ethan's weakness. He'd assumed family love would trump financial calculation. He'd been wrong about both his son and his daughter-in-law. Now, sitting in his driveway at 1 a.m., Frank felt the full weight of his isolation. Ellen was gone. Ethan had chosen Madison's vision over his father's welfare. The lake house that should have been sanctuary had become a target. But isolation also brought clarity. Frank was no longer protecting family relationships that existed only in his imagination. He was protecting assets, independence, and dignity from people who viewed all three as obstacles to their own advancement. His phone buzzed with another text from Ethan. Dad, please call me. We need to talk about what happened tonight. Frank deleted the message without reading it completely. Talk would come later, after Denise had implemented the legal protections they'd developed. After Madison discovered that her assumptions about Frank's resources were dramatically incomplete. After Ethan learned the cost of choosing his wife's ambitions over his father's well-being. Frank turned off his truck and walked toward his house. The porch light illuminated the same cracked sidewalk, the same modest exterior, the same carefully maintained appearance of ordinary retirement. But appearances had been his protection and his vulnerability. Tomorrow, Madison would discover that the harmless old janitor she'd been manipulating was neither harmless nor poor. She would learn that decades of careful planning had created resources and legal protections she'd never anticipated. Tonight was the last night Frank would pretend to be less than he was. 3 days after the wedding, Frank sat across from Denise Park in her downtown Houston office, 23 floors above the city's morning traffic. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the sprawl of subdivisions stretching toward Lake Houston. The same communities where his rental properties provided steady income streams Madison had never suspected. Denise opened a thick file folder and spread its contents across her mahogany conference table. Let's begin with the foundation, she said, handing Frank a document marked Confidential Asset Summary, F. Delgado. The pages listed everything: 4 rental duplexes in Northeast Houston generating $8,400 monthly income, the small strip mall in Kashmir Gardens with 6 commercial tenants, 40 acres of undeveloped land south of the city, investment accounts with Fidelity and Vanguard totaling $847,000, and the lake house valued at $1.2 million by Harris County assessors. Frank studied the numbers, feeling strange to see 30 years of careful accumulation reduced to spreadsheet entries. I never wanted to be rich, Denise. I just wanted to be secure. You achieved security, Denise replied. But you've been playing the poor retiree so convincingly that even your family believes it. Madison based her entire strategy on the assumption that you're financially vulnerable. That was the point, Frank thought. He and Ellen had deliberately cultivated the image of modest retirement shopping at discount stores. Driving old vehicles, maintaining the same small house they'd owned for 23 years. Invisible wealth had been their protection against exactly the kind of manipulation Madison had attempted. But invisibility had made him vulnerable to different threats. People who couldn't see his resources also couldn't see his strength. Denise pulled out a second folder, slimmer but more dangerous. This is where we address the immediate threats. The folder contained revocation notices Frank had pre-signed months earlier. Terminating his guarantee on Ethan's apartment lease, canceling automatic payments covering Madison's graduate school loans, stopping the anonymous monthly transfers that had supplemented their household budget by $3,900. They've been living on your money for 2 years, Denise explained. Madison knows financial support is coming from somewhere, but she assumes it's government assistance or charity from your former employer. She has no idea you're their primary benefactor. Frank's throat tightened. I thought I was protecting my son from becoming someone like Madison. Instead, I enabled his dependence on someone like Madison. The irony was bitter. Frank's secret generosity had funded the lifestyle that allowed Madison to look down on him as a financial burden. His quiet support had given her the security to scheme against him. Roy Mitchell knocked on the conference room door, carrying a manila envelope thick with photographs and documents. Despite being 68 and officially retired, Roy moved with military precision that reminded Frank why they'd become friends. Both men understood the value of preparation and the cost of complacency. Got what you asked for, Roy said, settling into a chair beside Frank. Took me 3 weeks to put it all together. Roy opened the envelope and arranged its contents chronologically across the table. The first photos showed Madison removing mail from Frank's mailbox on dates when he'd been visiting the doctor or shopping for groceries. Later images captured her meeting with the property assessor across Lake Houston, pointing out Frank's house and dock while the man took measurements and photos. She's been surveilling your property for months, Roy explained. This assessor works for Brennan Development, the company that's been buying up lakefront lots for luxury housing projects. Denise studied the photographs with professional interest. This documents intent to defraud. Combined with the healthcare proxy forgeries and the guardianship consultation, we have a clear pattern of elder financial abuse. Frank examined a photo showing Madison and the assessor standing on Roy's dock, using binoculars to study his house. The image captured her pointing at his boat slip, his waterfront access, the mature oak trees that added value to the property. She'd been conducting due diligence like a commercial real estate investor. While I was grieving Ellen and trying to maintain family relationships, Madison was treating me like a business opportunity. The evidence continued printed emails between Madison and Dr. Harper discussing cognitive decline documentation, bank statements showing Madison had applied for credit cards. Using Frank's address, Medicare explanation of benefits for appointments Frank had never attended. The fraudulent medical claims are federal offenses, Denise noted. Leonard Hayes has contacts at the FBI who specialize in Medicare fraud cases. Leonard Hayes, Ellen's cousin, had been watching from a distance since her funeral, monitoring Frank's situation with the practiced eye of a retired federal investigator. His involvement suggested tonight's wedding confrontation was part of a larger pattern he'd been documenting. Leonard's been building a file on Madison for 18 months, Denise continued. He approached me last year about protecting you legally, but I needed your permission to act. Frank felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. While he'd been trying to preserve family harmony, people who actually cared about his welfare had been preparing to defend him. What do we do now? Frank asked. Denise opened her laptop and pulled up a legal document. First, we implement the Senior Protection Trust we discussed. This removes your major assets from direct inheritance and places them in a protective structure. The lake house remains yours for life, but Madison can never inherit it or force its sale. Frank read the trust provisions carefully. Upon his death, the lake house and investment accounts would fund a foundation supporting seniors targeted by financial abuse, the very crime being perpetrated against him. If Ethan wants a relationship with you, he builds it based on love, not inheritance expectations, Denise explained. If Madison wants your property, she can buy it at fair market value. But she'll never be able to claim it through guardianship or inheritance manipulation. The trust represented more than legal protection, it was a declaration of independence. Frank was no longer a target to be manipulated, but a man with resources and agency who could choose his own destiny. What about the Medicare fraud? Frank asked. Leonard is coordinating with federal investigators, Denise said. Dr. Harper has been running similar scams on other elderly patients. Your case provides additional evidence for a larger prosecution. Roy leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. Nothing I like better than seeing predators get what they deserve. Frank signed the trust documents with steady hands, feeling stronger with each signature. For 30 years, he'd accumulated wealth quietly while projecting modest means. Tonight, modest means would give way to quiet strength. Madison won't discover the extent of your assets until she tries to challenge the trust, Denise warned. When she realizes what she's lost access to, her reaction could be extreme. Frank nodded. He'd spent months being careful, diplomatic, trying to preserve relationships with people who viewed him as an obstacle to overcome. Careful had gotten him slapped in a ballroom and nearly trapped in a fraudulent guardianship. I'm done being careful, Frank said. It's time to be clear. As the meeting concluded, Frank looked out the office windows at Houston's sprawling suburbs. Somewhere in that maze of subdivisions, Madison was probably planning her next move. Confident that the old man she'd humiliated at the wedding was too confused and powerless to resist her schemes. She was about to learn that assumptions could be expensive mistakes. And Frank was finally ready to teach her the lesson. When Frank returned to Cypress Ridge Country Club 3 hours after leaving, the wedding reception had settled into its final phase. The jazz quartet played softly near the terrace doors while remaining guests clustered around cocktail tables. Their conversations muted by champagne and the lateness of the hour. Frank entered through the main ballroom doors accompanied by Denise Park and Roy Mitchell. Denise wore a tailored navy suit that announced professional authority, while Roy carried a leather portfolio with the bearing of someone accustomed to military precision. Frank had changed into a fresh shirt and tie, his appearance modest but no longer apologetic. The band's music faltered as heads turned toward the unexpected trio. Conversations died mid-sentence as guests recognized Frank, the old man who'd been publicly humiliated hours earlier, now returning with reinforcements. Madison stood near the head table in her wedding dress, champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Her makeup had been touched up, her hair restyled, but her eyes showed the strain of managing the fallout from the evening's earlier drama. "Oh, for God's sake," she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Didn't we finish the embarrassing part already?" Denise stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. "I'm looking for Mr. Ethan Delgado and Mrs. Madison Delgado. I'm Denise Park, representing Mr. Frank Delgado in several urgent legal matters." Ethan raised a confused hand from where he'd been speaking with Madison's parents. "That's us. Who exactly are you?" "I'm Mr. Delgado's financial and legal advisor," Denise replied. "We need to discuss some immediate changes to your living situation." Madison laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "A financial advisor? For him?" She gestured toward Frank like he was an exhibit in a museum. "You must have the wrong client." Denise opened her briefcase with a metallic click that echoed across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "Mr. Ethan Delgado," she said, consulting a document. "Effective immediately, your father revokes his guarantee on your rental agreement at 1847 West Alabama, Unit 3B. You have 30 days to provide alternative guarantors or vacate the premises." The color drained from Ethan's face. "He can't do that. Dad doesn't have money for guarantees." "Actually, he does," Denise replied calmly. "He's been covering your $2,400 monthly rent for 18 months through automatic transfers you apparently assumed were government assistance." Gasps rippled through the wedding guests. Madison's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. "That's impossible. He lives on Social Security." Denise consulted another document. "Mrs. Madison Delgado, your graduate school loans with the University of Houston have also been transferred back to your personal responsibility. The anonymous payments covering your tuition and fees have been discontinued as of tonight." Madison's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "Anonymous payments? What anonymous payments?" $47,000 over 2 years, Denise read from her notes. "Mr. Delgado has been funding your education while you simultaneously planned to have him declared incompetent." The ballroom erupted in whispers. Madison's parents exchanged shocked glances across their table. Ethan stared at his father as if seeing a complete stranger. "Furthermore," Denise continued, "the monthly household supplements you've been receiving will also cease." Mr. Delgado has been providing $3,900 per month to cover utilities, groceries, and incidental expenses for your household. Roy stepped forward, opening his leather portfolio to reveal an array of photographs. This is Mrs. Delgado removing mail from Mr. Delgado's mailbox on 17 separate occasions. He held up the images for nearby guests to see. This is her meeting with property assessors to evaluate Mr. Delgado's lake house without his knowledge or consent. Ethan's voice cracked as he examined the photographs. Mads, what is this? Why were you taking Dad's mail? Madison's composure finally shattered. I was trying to help him. He can't keep track of important documents. He forgets appointments. He needs someone to manage his affairs. Denise produced another set of papers. Mr. Delgado's cognitive assessment scores, conducted by an independent neuropsychologist last week, place him in the 91st percentile for his age group. He shows no signs of dementia, confusion, or memory impairment. Independent assessment. Frank had insisted on professional validation after Madison's attempts to establish cognitive decline. The results had been unambiguous. His mental faculties remained sharp, organized, and fully competent for financial decision-making. The appointments you scheduled with Dr. Harper, Denise continued, were part of a fraudulent scheme to establish guardianship over Mr. Delgado. Dr. Harper has been arrested by federal agents for Medicare fraud and elder financial abuse involving over 40 victims. The ballroom felt completely silent. Madison stood frozen in her wedding dress, her carefully constructed narrative collapsing around her. The concerned daughter-in-law caring for a confused elderly man had become the predator targeting a vulnerable senior. But Frank wasn't vulnerable, and he'd never been confused. Finally, Denise said, producing a final document, Mr. Delgado has established an irrevocable trust placing his assets beyond inheritance manipulation. Upon his death, his estate will fund the Harris County Senior Protection Foundation rather than passing to direct heirs. A guest near the back whispered, smart man. Protects himself and helps other seniors. Madison found her voice, desperation replacing calculation. He doesn't understand what he's doing. He's been manipulated by lawyers who want his money. This is elder abuse. Frank stepped forward, speaking for the first time since entering the ballroom. His voice was quiet but carried with unmistakable authority. Madison, I understand perfectly well what I'm doing. I've understood for months what you've been doing. The difference is that I chose to hope for better from my family. He turned to address the assembled guests, many of whom had witnessed her public assault hours earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize again for the disruption. But sometimes family business requires a public setting to ensure everyone hears the truth clearly. Frank faced his son directly. Ethan, you have 30 days to decide whether you want a relationship based on love and respect. Or whether you prefer the one based on financial expectations your wife created for you. Ethan's face crumpled with the weight of sudden understanding. Dad, I didn't know about any of this. I swear I didn't know she was. I know, Frank said gently. But you didn't ask, either. You assumed I was the problem when your wife suggested it. You never defended me when she disrespected me. You stood behind her when she hit me. The truth hung in the ballroom air like smoke. Ethan had chosen Madison's version of reality over his father's dignity. Financial support over family loyalty, convenience over curiosity about the man who'd raised him. Frank turned back to Madison, who stood amid the wreckage of her schemes. You wanted to know about my finances, Madison. You wanted to manage my property, control my medical decisions, and inherit my assets. You've learned about my finances. But you'll never manage my property, never control my decisions, and never inherit my assets. He paused, letting the finality of his words settle over the watching crowd. The lake house will remain mine until I die. When I die, it will serve other seniors facing the same manipulation you attempted. You gambled that I was too old, too confused, and too isolated to resist you. Frank's voice hardened with quiet satisfaction. You lost that bet. As Madison began to cry not with grief but with the fury of thwarted ambition, Frank walked toward the ballroom doors with Denise and Roy flanking him like bodyguards. Behind them, the wedding reception continued in shocked whispers and uncomfortable silence. The old janitor everyone had underestimated had just reminded them that appearances could be deceiving, assumptions could be expensive. And family loyalty was a choice rather than an obligation. The reckoning was complete. 6 weeks after the wedding that ended a marriage before it truly began, Frank stood on his lake house dock, watching the Texas sun paint Lake Houston in shades of gold and amber. The water lapped gently against the wooden posts he'd repaired countless times over 15 years. This morning, the dock felt less like maintenance and more like meditation. Madison had left Houston 3 days after the wedding reception, her departure as dramatic as her arrival 2 years earlier. The annulment papers cited fraudulent inducement, a legal phrase that meant Madison had married Ethan under false pretenses about Frank's wealth and mental capacity. Ethan had signed without contest, his signature shaky but his decision firm. Now Frank's son sat beside him on the dock, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold while they watched a great blue heron fish in the shallows. The bird moved with patient precision, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Frank had learned something about patience recently. "Dad," Ethan said quietly, "I need to understand how I got it so wrong." Frank had been expecting this conversation for weeks. His son's face showed the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd discovered that his entire life had been built on lies. He'd chosen to believe because they were more comfortable than difficult truths. "You got it wrong because you wanted it to be easy," Frank replied. Madison made everything seem simple. She had answers for problems you didn't know existed. She promised you a future that didn't require questioning the past. Ethan stared at the water, where the heron continued its motionless vigil. "But I should have questioned it. I should have asked why you were struggling financially when you seemed to manage fine. I should have wondered why Madison knew so much about guardianship law and Medicare fraud." Should have. The phrase that haunted every relationship destroyed by willful blindness. "The mind sees what it wants to see," Frank said. "Madison told you I was declining, so you looked for evidence of decline. She told you I was struggling, so you assumed I needed rescuing. She told you she loved you enough to worry about our family's future, so you interpreted manipulation as care." A fish jumped near the far shore, sending concentric circles across the lake's surface. The heron's head turned slightly but didn't break its focused stance. Hunting required commitment to the process, not just desire for the result. "How'd I make this right?" Ethan asked. Frank had spent 6 weeks considering that question. Some damage couldn't be repaired, only acknowledged. Some trust, once broken, became something different when rebuilt, stronger in some ways, more fragile in others. "You start by accepting that it can't be made right," Frank said. "It can only be made different. Better, maybe, but different." They sat in comfortable silence as the morning progressed. Across the lake, Roy Mitchell's pickup truck pulled into his driveway. The old soldier beginning another day of retirement that looked suspiciously like community service. Roy had spent the past month helping other elderly neighbors install security cameras and organize their financial documents. Madison's attempted fraud had awakened the neighborhood's protective instincts. Denise Park's car appeared on the winding road that led to Frank's house. She visited twice weekly now, not just to manage his finances but to coordinate the Senior Protection Foundation that would eventually inherit his estate. The foundation was already helping 6 families facing elder financial abuse, funded by Frank's current income rather than his future bequests. Why wait until death to make a difference? Frank had asked Denise when they'd established the foundation. "I have enough for several lifetimes. Other seniors need help now." As Denise approached the dock, Frank noticed she wasn't alone. A young woman walked beside her, carrying a baby and wearing the uncertain expression of someone stepping into an unfamiliar situation. Ethan stood quickly, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that looked like hope. Elena? Elena Carter had been part of Ethan's life before Madison. A relationship that had ended when Madison returned from graduate school with bigger ambitions and smaller tolerance for competition. Elena worked as a pediatric nurse at Houston Methodist, lived modestly in a garden apartment near the medical center, and apparently had something important to discuss. "Hello, Ethan," Elena said softly. The baby in her arms couldn't be more than 4 months old, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to study everything with intense curiosity. This is Noah, your son. The dock seemed to tilt under Frank's feet. Grandson. The word hit him like a physical blow, not of pain but of overwhelming possibility. For months, he'd been fighting to protect assets he'd accumulated for a family that appeared to value only money. Now family had a different face. Ethan stared at the baby with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. My son? Elena, why didn't you tell me? I tried, Elena said, tears beginning to fall. When I found out I was pregnant, I called you. Madison answered your phone. She told me you were engaged and didn't want contact with previous mistakes. She said if I bothered you again, she'd have me fired from the hospital. Frank felt rage building in his chest, not the sharp anger of betrayal but the steady burn of justice deferred. Madison's cruelty had extended beyond financial fraud to emotional terrorism, poisoning relationships and isolating potential threats to her plans. I saw what happened at the wedding, Elena continued. It was all over social media. When I learned what kind of person Madison really was, I realized Noah deserved to know his father and grandfather. Ethan reached out tentatively, and Elena placed the baby in his arms. Noah gurgled softly, tiny fingers grasping Ethan's shirt with unconscious trust. Frank watched his son's face transform as reality shifted around him. Not just a father, but a father who'd been denied the chance to choose fatherhood. Can I hold him? Frank asked. Elena nodded, and Ethan carefully transferred Noah to his grandfather's arms. The baby weighed almost nothing but somehow felt substantial, real, like the most important responsibility Frank had ever accepted. Noah's eyes found Frank's face and held contact with the solemn intensity of someone conducting a job interview. He has Ellen's eyes, Frank realized. Not the color, but the quality of seeing more than most people revealed. Elena, Frank said carefully, what do you need? For yourself and for Noah? Elena's tears flowed harder. I don't need money, Mr. Delgado. I have a good job and my own insurance. I just need Noah to know his family. I need him to understand that his father didn't abandon him deliberately. Frank looked at his son, who was staring at Noah with wonder and grief and determination all competing for space on his face. Ethan had lost a fraudulent marriage but gained authentic fatherhood. The trade seemed overwhelmingly favorable. Elena, would you and Noah like to stay at the lake house for a while? Frank offered. There's plenty of space, and Noah should get to know his father and grandfather. Elena's relief was visible. Are you sure? I don't want to impose on your life. Impose on my life. Frank almost laughed. For 6 weeks, he'd been protecting a life built around accumulating assets for theoretical future needs. Now future needs had arrived in the form of a 4-month-old boy who would need college funds, down payment assistance, wedding costs, and countless other investments in human potential. Elena, you're not imposing on my life. You're giving my life purpose. As the morning progressed, they moved from the dock to the house, where Elena began the process of turning the lake house's spare bedroom into a temporary nursery. Ethan assembled a portable crib with the focused intensity of someone trying to rebuild his entire identity through proper hardware installation. Frank watched from the kitchen doorway, Noah sleeping in his arms while the house filled with sounds of family, Elena humming. While she organized baby supplies, Ethan muttering instructions to himself, Denise making phone calls about legal document updates, Roy arriving with tools and unsolicited advice about baby-proofing. This is what Ellen wanted, Frank realized. Not just financial security, but family continuation. Not just assets accumulated, but lives improved. Not just protection from fraud, but investment in love. That evening, as sunset painted the lake in familiar colors, Frank sat on his porch with Noah in his lap while Ethan and Elena talked quietly on the dock. Their conversation was careful, tentative, full of questions about the past and possibilities for the future. They were strangers who shared a child, trying to build something new from broken pieces of what might have been. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "This isn't over. You stole my future. I'll find a way to get what I deserve." Madison, apparently, hadn't finished fighting. Frank deleted the message and blocked the number. Some people never learned that fighting for the wrong things guaranteed losing everything that mattered. As the sky darkened, Frank's house glowed with warm light from every window. Elena cooked dinner in his kitchen, using spices and techniques that made familiar ingredients taste like celebration. Ethan helped with an eagerness that suggested he'd been hungry for useful purpose longer than he'd realized. Family dinners, Frank thought. How long since this table hosted actual family? After dinner, Elena bathed Noah in the kitchen sink while Ethan hovered nearby with towels and unnecessary assistance. The baby's delighted squeaks echoed through the house, mixing with Elena's laughter and Ethan's amazed commentary on every small developmental milestone. Frank cleaned dishes and listened to the sounds of domestic happiness he'd thought were finished forever. The lake house, which had felt too large and empty for a widowed man, was suddenly exactly the right size for a growing family. Later, as Elena fed Noah his bedtime bottle and Ethan watched with fascination, Frank stepped onto the porch for a moment of quiet reflection. The lake stretched dark and peaceful under scattered stars, the water lapping gently against his dock. Across the lake, lights were coming on in houses where other families were settling in for the evening. Some of those houses belonged to developers now, waterfront properties converted to luxury estates for Houston's elite. But some still belonged to people like Frank, longtime residents who'd chosen to stay, to adapt, to find new purposes for familiar spaces. Frank pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in months, his attorney who specialized in estate planning. "Frank, everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," Frank said. "I need to update my will. I have a grandson now." The conversation was brief but comprehensive. Noah would inherit the lake house, with provisions for education, health care, and general welfare administered through the Senior Protection Foundation until he reached adulthood. Elena would have lifetime use rights to ensure Noah's stability. Ethan would inherit investment accounts sufficient for security but not so much as to eliminate motivation for personal achievement. After ending the call, Frank remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds of Lake Houston. Somewhere in the house behind him, Elena was singing softly to Noah while Ethan learned to change diapers. The sounds of family rebuilding itself from honesty instead of convenience. Frank's reflection was interrupted by Elena's voice from the doorway. "Mr. Delgado?" Nose settled for the night. "Would you like to say good night to him?" Frank found his grandson sleeping peacefully in the portable crib, tiny fists curled beside his head. Breathing with the absolute trust of someone who'd never been disappointed by the people responsible for his care. Frank touched Noah's hand gently, feeling the baby's fingers reflexively grip his thumb. "You'll grow up knowing the difference between love and money," Frank promised silently. "You'll understand that family is something you choose every day, not something you inherit automatically." As Frank prepared for bed that night, he caught his reflection in the bedroom mirror that had shown him feeling old and vulnerable just weeks earlier. The same gray hair, the same lined face, the same modest appearance that had hidden strength Madison never suspected. But tonight, the reflection showed something else, a man who'd fought for what mattered and won more than he'd hoped for. Outside his window, Lake Houston continued its eternal rhythm against the shoreline. The water that had witnessed 30 years of plans and dreams and careful accumulation now reflected new possibilities. A grandson to spoil with attention and wisdom. A son learning to be the father he'd never chosen to become. A young woman brave enough to demand honesty from people who'd given her lies. Frank turned off the bedside lamp and listened to the house settling around him. Elena's quiet movements as she prepared bottles for night feedings. Ethan's restless turning in the guest room as he processed the day's revelations. Noah's soft breathing through the baby monitor Elena had insisted Frank needed in his bedroom. Family sounds, Frank thought. The best kind of wealth. As sleep approached, Frank felt Ellen's presence in the familiar darkness of their bedroom. Not supernatural visitation, but the kind of persistent love that continues shaping decisions long after death ends conversations. "You would have loved Noah," Frank told her silently. "You would have seen right through Madison from day one. You would have helped Elena feel welcome immediately. But you would have been proud of me tonight," he added. "For finally standing up instead of just standing strong." Outside, Lake Houston whispered its approval against the dock Frank had built with his own hands 15 years earlier. The same dock where he'd taught Ethan to fish before marriage and ambition complicated their relationship. The same dock where Noah would learn to fish someday, continuing traditions that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with time generously shared. Frank closed his eyes and allowed contentment to settle over him like a familiar blanket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: legal paperwork to finalize, Elena and Noah's security, difficult conversations with Ethan about rebuilding trust, phone calls from Madison's attorney attempting to negotiate settlements that would never come. But tonight, his house was full of people who belonged there by choice rather than obligation. Tonight, the lake house served its intended purpose: sheltering family, protecting what mattered, providing foundation for futures built on love instead of calculation. Life, Frank realized as sleep finally claimed him, doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything he went through means something today. The challenges, the betrayal, the public humiliation, the legal battles, all of it had been preparation for this moment when real family replaced its counterfeit version. Sometimes the best inheritance isn't money accumulated over decades, but wisdom earned through surviving people who saw you as nothing more than their opportunity. Sometimes the strongest families are the ones that rebuild themselves on truth instead of settling for comfort built on lies. Sometimes love is measured not in what you're willing to give, but in what you're willing to protect from people who don't deserve it. And sometimes, Frank thought as he drifted towards sleep in a house finally filled with the right voices, the second best time to start over is right